Hello and welcome. Well, picture this scenario with me for a moment, if you will, and it's one that every parent has experienced. Your toddler sat in a high chair, feeding themselves and surrounded by food mess. Now, their meal is equal parts on the table in front of them, on their clothes, their face, it's everywhere. Now, as a parent, what is your first instinct and how reactive to mess at mealtime are you? As a question, do you A, let your child be and just explore their food textures and take in the experiences for what it's worth? Or B, do you grab the first sponge or wet wipe that you can get your hands on and frantically clean their face and surroundings? Which of those two would you do? Now, personally, if you ask me, for what it's worth, I'd be more inclined to opt for B. I really like a clean and tidy kitchen. And if I had the time, I swear I would have OCD, but time just does not permit for me. So it's good for us to know that whatever your reaction is, that it may, in fact, possibly influence your child's eating habits later on in life, which is exactly what we're here to explore today with our special guest and resident expert in fussy eating, Marie-France Laval. Now, Marie-France is a dietitian, nutritionist, and counselor originally from France. She's also the CEO of Fussy Eater Solutions, where she offers a range of online and in-home programs to support fussy eaters and their families. Welcome back, Marie-France. How are you doing?
I'm very good, Rachel. What about you?
Yeah, very excited to chat with you on this topic because I know every parent at some point, of course, has maybe asked themselves this question and or definitely experienced this scenario. And of course, who doesn't love a clean and tidy kitchen and house for the most part? But, most of us don't like mess when children are feeding also. So initially, with all your years experience, do you think it's worthwhile for us to think about the impacts our reactions to children's mealtime mess may have, I guess, on raising a confident eater who can tackle most foods? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I certainly get asked the question all the time by parents who, when they start working with me, will start, to assess everything that they do and that they say. And so definitely, if you are a bit of a freak clean, it's not going to make your child a fussy eater. But if your child is struggling already with food and you are a freak clean parent, then it may really impact them. So as you said, we want the kids to be able to explore food. And food is really sensory in nature. So the kids who are really going to struggle from a sensory perspective with food need to be allowed to experiment as much as possible.
Okay. Now, there's lots to chat about this. I wanted to acknowledge first that we published your article titled Freaky Clean Parent, Fussy Eater Child. Now, for someone who hasn't read your article yet, please tell us what it's about and, of course, what inspired you to write it.
So it really started with the question of one parent I talked to lately who said, I don't allow my child to feed themselves. So is that going to make them fussy? And so I wanted to look into this. Obviously, there's no science into this. There are no studies. But we do understand this, the perspective, the fact that food is sensory in nature. And
Yep.
so kids are going to be involving themselves. They come into this world and start, experimenting with everything with their mouth. And eventually, when you get them to the table, they'll start to put their hands into food.
Yep.
So the article was answering that question, and I'm happy to discuss it further.
Okay, well, let's get stuck into it. Now, with all of your years' experience, I mean, have you found that there is a correlation between parents who are super clean and have children who are fussy eaters?
So definitely when the children are really struggling from a sensory perspective, and have parents who are super clean, I found that this is not going to be helpful. So let's say, and at the moment I do have a family like this, a little boy who's really throwing everything on the ground, really struggling with the food, and mom is constantly wiping his face, wiping his hands, picking food on the ground. So one of the first things we've done is actually to stop that and make sure that he is allowed to get messy and he gets cleaned up afterwards. So there are several things to look at here. But when you do not allow your child to self-feed, then they're not exploring the food. They're not getting their hands into challenging textures. So think about food in this way, it has many different smells. It looks different from one dish to the next. It feels different. It can be sticky. It can be hot. It can be cold, and it can be grainy. So allowing children to feel with their hands gives them a lot of really important information, right? And that's before they even bring the food to their mouth, if
Wow.
they do. So having that information is really important to them. It's just, imagine if we were blindfolding ourselves to tackle a new food. We would have to try to work out what it is we're dealing with, and our hands would give us much more information to start with. So we want that to happen as much as possible, particularly, the kids who are sensory, they're not going to touch the food. So this is a good indication if you're struggling already and that they are struggling too. So give them the possibility to explore with their hands, giving them the possibility to feed themselves is really, really important. So that's one thing. And then if you think about these parents who if you think about the parents who wipe the children before, during, and after meals constantly, that may create really negative associations with feeding, right? So imagine this, you have this child, he's got sticky puree on his face, around his mouth, and for some it's already quite difficult. And then you have this cold wipe that comes in, or this spoon, and sometimes think of the spoon, the metal spoon, for example, think of the metal spoon scraping the skin, and that may really create negative associations with eating, because if you sit down and there's somebody constantly cleaning you, then it's not so pleasant. But by the same token, having a parent who's very reactive, and cleaning all the time, what does that teach the child? If mom is always picking stuff on the floor during the meal. And then, of course, you have parents who will show that they're not happy with this, right? They may frown their faces, they may complain, they may say things like, stop dropping the food. They may become negative in the way they interact with the actions that their child is carrying out. So if possible, we also want to avoid this. So it's very difficult dealing with the mess at the table, but it's worth rethinking it in that context. And one last thing that parents will do, they may avoid all these sticky foods I was talking about earlier, the dips, the sauces, so by doing that and not allowing that child to experiment dipping into a sauce, for example, they may deprive them of an opportunity to associate two different foods. For example, they may dip a piece of bread in sauce. So here you have the texture of the bread, let's say it's dry and chewy, with the texture of the sauce, which is wet, cold, creamy. Perhaps it's even got lumps. So you can see that now becomes a complex food that perhaps the child was going to explore. So can we allow children to have that happening? Look, I do give the example of actually my sister years ago when she was a young mother and I didn't have any kids. My niece now is 30. She's a new mom herself. And I remember my sister telling me about this because we were feeding my niece. She had finished a meal and then she was painting her hair with yogurt, which we thought was really funny at the time. We were laughing and we took a picture of this. So a long time ago. And my sister said, this comes from Françoise Dolto, very famous child psychoanalyst in France, very, very famous. And she said it's called la bouffe plaisir, which is tucker pleasure. The idea that food is not just to be put in one's mouth and swallowed. There's a lot going on around it. So can it be fun too? And so a good piece of advice would be to allow parents to allow for a bit of interaction with feeding, and perhaps allow for a little bit of playing towards the end of the meal, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. You don't want the whole experience to be all about playing and throwing foods all the time. If that happens, it often means that there are underlying issues that we need to understand.
Okay. So what I'm hearing, and tell me if this is correct, typically the type of parental behaviors that can impact the chances of a child being raised as a confident eater would, for example, be the fact that if the parent cannot stand mess in the kitchen, would be things, for example, like wiping the faces during the meal times, cleaning up around the child and the food, avoiding sticky foods, and avoiding situations that may create unpleasant atmosphere, that may, for example, sort of raise some anxiety. So in particular, when we're talking about children who are potentially fussy eaters, why is this behavior not helpful?
Because it may just create more problems or reinforce the fact that eating is not pleasant, basically. And so you do want to make sure that eating is pleasant. And part of eating allows for some degree of exploration for all children, if possible.
Mm-hmm. And so then why is it unwise to clean a fussy eater's face during meal times? As you mentioned before, as tempting as it may be, it's best to refrain from scraping their face with a spoon or a wet wipe at dinner time, because this is going to have a negative association with eating and all that food, would you say?
Yeah, so if we do a bit of role reversal, imagine yourself on a chair and having somebody else who feeds you. In fact, it's really interesting to think about the elderly, because the elderly, in retirement homes will
Yeah.
often be fed. And one of the first things you teach people, and I have taught people to feed the elderly, is you should sit down with them. You shouldn't feed from the height. And you should have that rapport that allows for a comfortable feeding experience. So, if they're not comfortable, if they don't have their set of teeth, for example, the elderly, how are they going to eat? If you wipe them, how are they going to enjoy the experience? So really, with children, we need to think, how would it feel like if we
Yeah.
were in that position, and if we had somebody constantly wiping our face? And I like to use the idea of the metal spoon, because it's really quite unpleasant.
Yes, of course.
Imagine if you do it to your face. So yeah. So look, in the end, we want to accept that messy years of feeding are going to be happening.
Mhm.
And the sooner we can accept that, probably the better.
And you mentioned earlier also, so I just wanted to just go back to that for a moment, that when parents are really quick to react to mess with when a child has maybe dropped food, and they sort of pick it up and sort of tidy it around as well, why could maybe like a freak neatness or compulsive type of behavior maybe affect a child who is a fussy eater, do you think?
Because it really does create this atmosphere where the parents is really negative. Kids, they tune in, they sense the anxiety, they sense the disapproval from the parent who's really struggling. In fact, I do have another parent, and the child is on the spectrum, and this mom is really struggling with mess. And she'll tell me, she says, I really can't stand it. So we're trying to make it less so, but her child is very aware of it, and he'll complain about mess on himself. He'll start, ideally, I'd like him to be able to relax into a bit of mess, because that's the risk. He himself is really struggling. He's really struggling with more of the sensory sensitivity around the food. So can he become more comfortable, with we've worked with things like sauce and sticky foods, and so it may take him a few minutes to say, it's sticky, showing me his hands, and then relaxing. So we don't jump right away to clean this up. I try to see how long he can stay in that it's sticky, and I acknowledge that it is. So can he learn to relax, and then later on, can he learn to solve the problem himself? So I have another kid I'm thinking of as well, who will wipe his hands really well all the time at meal times. And so he works it out himself, but he
Mm.
allows for himself to dig in and explore, which, is probably why this particular other child I'm thinking about has done a lot of progress with the food range that he's eating, because he's really comfortable having his hands in the food, and then he's really comfortable working out what to do at the end of his meal.
And for this reason, is this why you shouldn't avoid sauce and dips as well? As you mentioned earlier on, is to give them the ability to be able to be uncomfortable, which is going to reduce their anxiety in the future.
There's exactly what you said. Allowing them to get a little bit uncomfortable and allowing for them to work out what to do as they
Mm.
get older. Not jumping. We jump. We always give the solution to kids. And so can we just wait a little bit? Can we let them work it out? Can we let them tackle what is bothering them? I think it's really important.
And sort of moving on to, I guess, self-feeding, how can not allowing a child to self-feed backfire? I'd love to know.
So I meet a lot of families, and there are different cultural backgrounds as well in families that I meet. But let's say for some families, it will be that traditionally, kids are not allowed to feed themselves. So they will be fed for the first 2 or 3 years. And you can see the impact it has in terms of them advancing the food that they will eat when they become, for a variety of reasons, really fussy. So you definitely want to rethink that impact of the not allowing kids to self-feed.
Mm. So would you say children who are not allowed to self-feed or explore their food, as you were mentioning earlier, in that playful manner, may develop a lack of interest in feeding time? Do you think that they could potentially become disengaged and passive during sort of dinner time?
Yeah,
Um,
so I'm thinking, I'm so sorry, Rachel. Yeah, I'm thinking when you say that, of these kids who really are struggling and who are not feeding themselves, not exploring their food. And often the parents will start using a distraction to remove them from the eating process because it's so hard to feed them. And now we have a child who's really disengaging completely from the eating experience. So not only are they not looking at what's on the plate, they're not interacting with it, they're not touching it, and the spoon
mm.
comes in very mechanically almost. And these kids, you can always see how they are not there. They are not willing participants in the eating process.
So do you think that they may become concerned about sort of mess themselves? And in that, maybe this behavior means that the child is at risk of becoming more hesitant to even touch the food also?
Well, I would think that if they get a reaction every time there's mess, and that's a disapproval or a stress reaction from the parent, then definitely that is likely to make feeding and more difficult, and mess more difficult for them to accept.
Mm.
So if we want to raise confident eaters, competent eaters, would definitely have to allow for some mess for some years in the feeding process. So we almost have to think, how are we going to accept mess? How are we going to manage mess in a way that's not negative or impacting our child negatively?
And then, so you mentioned earlier on about the five senses. I just love to know, why is it so important then that children learn to explore food with all of their five senses? I'd love to know.
Well, because some of the science really tells us that they cannot, it's not, eating is not about grabbing a piece of chicken, putting in your mouth and swallowing it. Us adults think that this is what it is, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So I did say earlier that touching the food gives us a lot of information about the food. So these are steps or stages that are necessary for a child to then be able to bring the food into their mouth and eventually explore it perhaps spit it out or explore it and chew it and then spit it out, or then perhaps chew it and swallow it.
But in your experience, then, does this mean, and you think that this could sort of further develop a child struggling from a sensory perspective if they're not using all their five senses during mealtime?
So it's not, I mean, it's not if they're not using their five senses at mealtime, it's more that, what they are dealing with at mealtimes. So if they are overwhelmed with, from a sensory perspective, you may have to think the meal differently. But no, I was just really about allowing them to be having this experience so that from a sensory perspective, they can become more familiar with those challenging textures or temperatures or simply the variety of food that's at their disposal or that's offered to them.
Mhm. So for the parents that do like a neat and tidy kitchen and sort of eating environment, then why is accepting that mealtime's messy key? I'd love to know.
Well, because it's going to go on for years. And I like to tell the story of my own kitchen. My own kids now are in their early 20s. And I remember, I think they were about 7 or 8 years old, perhaps for the eldest. So it was the time when I realized that my kitchen was finally mine again. There were no food droppings anymore. And I had this tablecloth, like a plasticky type of tablecloth. And I removed it, right? Quite happy with myself. And as I proceeded to clean it, I realized that the bottom edge was all curled back in. And there were food scrapings stuck in there from the years of feeding, which is not a very pleasant sight. But it shows how much had gone on in these feeding times, and how much you have to bear in the process and allow for it to happen. One day you'll get your kitchen again. So these days, by the way, there are plenty of products, and I think you sell quite a few on Kiddipedia, where there are mats to put on the floor that are an easy wipe. There are trays that catch the foods before it lands on the floor, and you can adapt them to most chairs. So there are a number of things you can do to make your life easier with the mess.
And so what about throwing food? I mean, how much should parents really tolerate to find balance with that? I know for a fact I've seen photos of myself as a baby, and I had pasta, I threw pasta all over the walls, and my poor parents had to clean that as well. So it is a very common thing that the toddlers do. But I mean, what about forget dropping it on the floor, but throwing food as well?
So, often kids will start throwing food on the floor because they are towards the end of the meal. They just had it. So there may come a time where you start saying, I can see you've had enough to eat. Let's see if we can move on from the meal. So you may bring the meal to the end. If they are throwing food and you are reactive, you become a spectator and they want to engage further with you. So they may end up throwing more food. If you are reacting negatively, then that may add stress to the situation. So it's always a matter of, not taking too much notice and not taking excessive throwing on the floor either. So best would be to decide with the child to say, are you still hungry? Because I can see you throw the food on the ground, so perhaps we're done here. So it's best to bring the meal to the end.
At the end. Okay. So we've covered off a lot of really helpful information today. If you were to summarize your key messages for anyone watching and listening, what tips can you share that can limit the toll on parents?
So the key message is definitely that if you are a freak clean, it is not going to make your child a fussy eater. But if you're struggling with your child and you are a freak clean, then it pays to think about what that may do, how reactive you are, what that may do to your child's potential in becoming a competent, confident eater. So the tip really is take a step back, rethink how you view cleaning and how, what is the experience your child is having at meal times? Is it positive or is it negative? Is it negative for the both of you? Are you stuck in that, mess? I don't like mess. My child is messy bubble, and that's not helping you and it's not helping them.
All right, this is awesome. Now, if parents have got any questions and or that they would like to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Or they can find me on Instagram at Fussy Eater Solutions. They can find me on my website at fussyeater.com.au.
Wonderful. And we'll have all of those links in the show notes. Marie-France, as always, an absolute pleasure, and look forward to chatting with you again in the future. Until then, take care and stay safe. Okay, bye.
Thanks, Rachel.